Well, it's a pleasure to be able to speak here. Indeed, I did leave my laptop in Chicago the other day, but it's coming back to me, I've been told, so I'm quite relieved. And I do have a presentation that I did not have on the laptop, but on a memory stick. So we should be okay. I've titled my talk, Teaching and Learning Against the Grain While Going with the Flow. And that's, of course, there's some thinking behind that. At the moment, worldwide, we see an increased concern about the kinds of sustainability challenges that we tend to be talking about, whether that's loss of biodiversity, climate change, or food and nutrition security. And in policy and governance, more and more attention is paid to finding ways to respond to this. In that sense, people like us who are interested in teaching and learning in the context of sustainability challenges, it is a favorable climate, I think, to get schools, universities, NGOs interested in their role of teaching and learning. At the same time, we must also recognize that we are part of a rather powerful, forceful system, which we could call neoliberal systems or globalizing economy, that require some disruption, some kind of counter movement. And in that sense, we need to also go against the grain. So going with the flow, taking advantage of the momentum, but at the same time also cultivating a climate and a citizenry where people can get better at disrupting some of these very resilient systems that are not easily changed. In my talk, I will draw upon some of the work that we have been doing within the framework of the decade for EST, where we did some monitoring and evaluation activities in 2009 and in 2012. I was involved in the preparation of 2 reports about the different processes of learning taking place in the context of EST and the kinds of policies and structures around the world that are being put in place to make EST possible. I will draw upon that every now and then. First, I want to talk a little bit about the confusion around sustainability and sustainable development. As we all know, it is not an easy thing to speak about what is sustainability or what is sustainable development. And you could say that some argue that it means so many different things that it has no meaning at all. And there's a risk of it becoming a kind of an empty concept. From an educator's perspective, I would argue that it is an attractive concept because it forces you to give it meaning in the place where you are. It is dependent on where you are. It is dependent on what point in time you are. Sustainability is something that evolves in time, and even though we can never know what it is, we don't live long enough to know what it is something that we have to be looking for all the time. So sustainability is something that emerges in time, but that we'll never fully understand. Is from an education's point of view, I think, an interesting idea. But there's a risk when it is adopted by different groups in society that may not have sustainability interests at heart. It could easily become a form of, manipulating reality, greenwashing society, and by doing so, it could actually strengthen unsustainability. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. Here's an example of Volkswagen talking about sustainable excitement when introducing its new model. It's just an example of how the world of business and industry also looks at sustainability as an exciting concept that people are sympathetic towards. But the intent of Volkswagen probably is to sell as many cars as possible, which is their business. Coca-Cola Company is concerned about citizens becoming more concerned about, for instance, plastics in oceans, microplastics in oceans and waterways, even entering our bodies, as once DDT used to do, and still does in some parts of the world. And they come up with, they re-engineer their bottles to make them more sustainable, and they talk about plant bottles, for instance. And it says up to 30% plant-based, 100% recyclable. Now that's a positive message. Plant sounds good. Up to 30% sounds like a lot. Could also be 2%, because legally up to 30% could be anything under 30%. And 100% recyclable, that sounds very positive. In practice, only 2% of the bottles are recycled. So that's, again, leading to confusion among citizens who might think when they walk with their children in the forest and they have a bottle of Coke, why does, and the children ask, what do I do with my bottle? Just throw it in the forest. Maybe a tree will grow there next year because it's a plant bottle anyway. So things are framed in a way that could easily lead to kind of a confusion about what is happening and what needs to be done. And I think we need to be critical of the kind of world we live in. We focus a lot on individuals developing themselves, developing competencies and things like that. But we must also not forget the bigger structures of which we are part. The globalizing economy that still has growth, continuous growth, at the heart of its foundation. In that sense, sustainable growth, which often companies talk about, should be questioned as well. We need to think also about sustainable contraction, which is doing maybe less or doing more with less, or finding ways to utilize fewer resources in a creative way, which is not maybe the best idea from a current business model. It might be a good idea for future business models where the maximization of profit is not the most important thing, but maybe the maximization of meaning, which is something completely different. We do know that young children today, in most parts of the world, are almost injected with a consumer gene, where we are taught at an early age that we need to acquire things and that we need the latest technologies that are designed not to last very long. Sometimes that's referred to as planned obsolescence, things that become outdated quickly. Juliet Shore, on the lower left side, wrote this book, Born to Buy, where she shows that children growing up in metropolitan areas in North America at the age of 3 can already distinguish up to 200 different brands as a result of advertising. We also know that the world has about 2 billion people who are overnourished, getting too many calories and not always the best calories. And then the other form of malnutrition that we tend to talk about more is 1 billion people who are undernourished. So we see there's a shift in the trends, where we have a new kind of society that is good for business, you could say, but not good for people and planet. To complicate things further, there's also a lot of doubt within science about what actually goes on. Climate change is a good example where 99% of scientists agree more or less that humans are causing changes in the climate, that we are entering a new era, the Anthropocene, where it's humanity influencing geological formations, oceans, in a way that is unprecedented. But there are also those who still argue, and they also use science as scientific evidence to support their argument that these things are naturally happening, that it's the power of the sun or other explanations. Now, 99% may agree on one thing, but the 1% that disagrees gets about 50% or more of the media attention. So there's a lot of doubt among the public about what is happening and what needs to be done. And when there is doubt, it can lead to apathy, powerlessness, or not doing anything. And there are those who argue that this doubt is actually manufactured. It is intentionally put there so that we will not change. So, I work for a university, and some, maybe more of you do, and the status of the university and science in society is, you could say, going down. There's less trust in science today than there was, say, 10, 20, or 30 years ago. You could see that if you look at history, that 1,000 years ago, it was the heads of tribes and the elders. They had the trust, they had the wisdom. And then in time, you see shifts when religion rises. You see that the priests and the imams, they have the authority of truth. Then with enlightenment, you get the sciences emerging, and doctors, professors, headmasters of schools, they had a lot of authority. They were respected. But today, where is the authority of truth? If we look at some of the confusion, here are some questions. Here's one about genetically modified food. Here's a question, are genetically modified foods inevitable to feed the world? We have 9 billion, they say, in 2050. And some argue that we must, in order to feed the world, we must have genetically modified crops that reduces water use, pesticide use, etc. Now, I'm not sure how many of you would agree with this statement, that we need genetically modified foods. Not many, 0. Okay, how many of you do not agree that we need genetically modified food? Okay, so that's more people. In climate change, it's probably easier. Do people in this room think that it is humans causing climate change and that climate change is happening? How many of you agree with that? Okay, it's about a little more than half. Who thinks solar panels are sustainable? How many of you think solar panels are sustainable? How many of you think solar panels are unsustainable? Also a few. Is organically grown food, is that also sustainable? How many of you would say yes, it's also sustainable? How many of you would say organic, it can be organic, but it's not necessarily sustainable? Okay. See, it's a nice split. Are vegetables grown in cities healthy? Who would say yes? Yes. And who would say no, they're not healthy? Because, we have, particles in the air pollution settles on the leafy vegetables, and if you don't wash it well, then it could be a problem. So you see, with all these things, we don't exactly know. There's no consensus, even among highly intelligent people, as we all are. There are disagreements about what is going on and what should be done. Now, as educators, this is an interesting challenge. How can we teach around ambiguity, contested knowledge, while at the same time all agreeing that we have an urgent crisis on our hands? We must do something, but we don't know exactly what to do and what to teach. Maybe we cannot even teach it. Maybe it's not about teaching sustainability. Maybe it's about creating opportunities for learning. That's a slightly different way of phrasing it, but it's an important difference. E.O. Wilson, the biologist, says that today we can find information everywhere, and we can look up all these questions about solar panels, wind turbines, urban agriculture. If you Google it, you'll find hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of of sites where you will get information. But who put it there, with what intent, how old is that information? Knowledge changes all the time. So he says we're drowning in information, but we are starving for wisdom. And that, I think, is the challenge that we have, how create wiser citizens who can make better informed decisions that are not just based on knowledge, but also on values and a different relationship with people and planet. It's sometimes useful to categorize things. It can be dangerous too to do that, but there are ways of looking at these kinds of issues, from the more simple problems that have a clear definition for which we can find solutions that we can implement, we can see whether it works or not, we can measure the outcomes quite easily, to more complex problems where it takes a bit of work to understand the problem fully, where the definition, it takes some time to come up with a definition, where we have different groups in society that are involved and need to be involved, to the wicked problems, which are problems that cannot really be defined. Every time we think that we understand that something will happen or change, which makes it very difficult for us to understand it, and we need to reframe, redesign, rethink. The knowledge is ambiguous, contested. Look at climate change. It's a great example of a wicked problem. And each of these different types of problems requires a different form of teaching, learning, and research. And sustainability issues are often in the wicked category. So we live in interesting times, you could say. Highly complex issues, surrounded by uncertainty, contested knowledge, ambiguity is always present. And there's a kind of shallowness in the sense that we quickly look for answers. We turn to technology to get those answers quickly, but we don't really go into depth to fully understand or try to fully understand what is at the heart of these issues. As Google or Wikipedia doesn't help us much with that. That requires something else. And a lot of the issues that we try, the solutions that we try to implement, we don't really know what the effect or the impact will be, but we do know that we must try and experiment and create space for trying new things. To do things, not just to do things better, but also to do better things altogether. And that's a different thing. I'll get to that right now. The question of can we optimize our current way of living and our current lifestyles, which are based on a certain idea about what it means to be fulfilled citizens and what it means to be successful in business? Can we optimize these systems? Can we green those systems in a way that we can still live in harmony with the resources and the carrying capacity of the planet? Or do we need to rethink the very foundations upon which we build our society, which is to do with doing better things? So you could say we could do more of what we already do, but in a more efficient way. Or we could say, and we could do with an incremental optimization of societal processes and technological processes, new technologies. Or we need to radically redesign our societal processes and come up with alternative technologies that allow us to transition towards a different world. And that's probably, it's not either or, and we'll probably need a little bit of both, but we tend to emphasize the optimization much more in comparison to the transition perspective, which is probably what will, in the end, be needed. So here you have the same kind of figure, but now with a few examples. If you look at metropolitan agriculture, for instance, you could argue that that can be done with lots of technological innovations, vertical agriculture, using solar power, closed cycle design, which also requires a different kind of lifestyle, where people have more localized foods, are maybe developing a sense of community around urban agriculture. So it has to do with meaning making, it has to do with community, but it also has to do with new technology. And you could say that's a more transition perspective. Whereas if we develop genetically modified foods, a high-tech solution, it's a technological transition, it really is, but it doesn't really require us in society to change our way of thinking, and there might, or acting, or we can just go to the grocery store and continue to buy food. It doesn't really require any sense of community building or things like that. And you could say there are moral and ethical implications for that do require some transition if we want to go that way. Stephen Sterling, probably well known to some of you or many of you, he spoke about this transition perspective in education, how, or in society in general, how do companies or institutions or schools or universities respond to sustainability? And some, he would argue, they don't respond at all, although when he did this already 10 years ago or more, there were quite a few who were what he called in denial, saying, well, we as a university have been here for 400 years or whatever long, and we're still here, and we will continue to be here for the next 400 years. And sustainability is just, something that will pass. And then there are others who say, well, apparently there's a demand for this among students. We must do something. Let's have a course or a module on sustainability somewhere in our curriculum, and then we can say, yes, we do something about this. He calls that bolt on, just added on another book on the already full shelf. And then there's another category of institutions that might say, well, if we really want to take sustainability serious, we must integrate it not just in our curriculum, we must also connect it to our research, our public engagement, and we must also walk the talk in the sense that what we do as an institution should reflect sustainability. So we should have some solar, and we should have maybe some green energy, and we should maybe have healthier food in the canteen and things like that, to make it more believable that what we talk about we actually live or do. He calls that built in. And the last level of transition he calls a whole system redesign, where you say, well, if we really want to take it seriously, we have to have a good look at how we organize everything we do. Maybe we don't need courses or even bachelor's and master's degrees anymore. We need to work in a very different way. Maybe our learning should be rooted in society and not in classrooms. Maybe the students should be actively involved in the designing of the canteen and in deciding on how we build new buildings on campus. It should be part of the curriculum. So then you start rethinking, you get kind of a learning ecology, which is a radical departure of how things are today. But there are some examples of this around the world. It's good to realize that this transition perspective needs to start somewhere, a transition. Oftentimes these are in niches, small groups of people who experiment with new ideas that at the beginning are not getting a lot of traction and are seen as somewhat far away, wild, disconnected. Think of the first farmers 30, 40 years ago building getting a wind turbine on their land in Germany, for instance. Other farmers looked at that with surprise and kind of laughed it off like a waste of money. It doesn't make any sense. And in some ways it didn't financially make sense because the technology wasn't as advanced as it is today. And then eventually you see energy prices go up. The technology gets better, cheaper. The government starts giving subsidies. And then other farmers are thinking, hey, it's cheaper now. It actually makes sense. More farmers get wind turbines. They add solar to it as well. And you see that this niche is becoming a regime. More people do it. It gets amplified. People get attracted to it. And then in the last stage, when E.ON in Germany, the big energy company, decides to abolish all coal-burning and nuclear facilities to become 100% renewable in 2020, you can see that the regime has become a landscape. It has shifted altogether. Now, studying these transitions is very interesting, I think, for us to see where are the ways that we can accelerate these kinds of transitions. And if you look at these transitions, you can see that the number of people involved increases over time, that the diversity of actors increases over time, that you can see that the routines that were somewhat odd become normalized and accepted in society. There are shifts in cultures, and it transituates from one situation to another. And there are probably other indicators of these kinds of transitions. We've done some work at Wageningen University where we looked at transitions, in this case in a small setting, an early childhood center in the south of Holland that wanted to green its schoolyards, basically, so that they become more livable, healthier, playful for the children. And it sounds like an easy example, but it's quite a complex thing to transform a school in that way. And we looked at the various tipping points that led to an acceleration in this transition towards a new way of organizing this early childhood center. And looking at tipping points and the resilience that you find in learning towards sustainability, we can get a better sense of how do you support this type of learning, how do you facilitate it, what are some of the indicators of change, what blocks a transition towards sustainability, and what can you prevent from it to roll down again, that ball, because that could easily happen as well. I think we need to, as educators and as researchers, we do need to pay more attention to how people learn in transitions towards a change of not only knowledge, but also of values, of connecting with people and place. In the Netherlands, we talk nowadays about the Big Five, involving actors representing these different corners in that diamond that you see here. So the world of research, the world of education, the world of business, private sector, NGOs, societal organizations, and the world of governance, where we see a shift from government in Holland and policymakers to governance, where the government provides spaces or arenas where these people can meet and negotiate, learn, and co-create sustainability. It is not something that is designed elsewhere and then handed down to society, because we know that does not work. There needs to be joint ownership. So let's talk a little bit more about the learning then. This is the third final part of my talk. Transmissive learning, the handing over, versus what we call T4 learning for the moment, which is, for lack of a better term. And T4 learning refers to transdisciplinary learning. I think we all have a sense that the way we've organized our university still is very much based on disciplines. We need to not just work interdisciplinarily, but we need to transcend disciplines by starting from the real issues and then seeing how disciplinary knowledge might contribute to that, but not starting from the disciplines. Transboundary learning, that means these Big Five, these different spheres in society that need to overlap, that need to become more hybrid, need to be connected. On the edges of these different systems, that's where the most energy usually is. It does require some careful management of these differences. Transformative learning, that refers not just to learning for knowing or learning for doing, or even learning for being, but also learning to make change. How do you make change? How do you create more connected, more committed, more motivated, more empowered citizens? And finally, transgressive learning. That's a relatively new one, but it refers to transgressing, disrupting, very stubborn routines that we all take for granted, that we never ever question, but ultimately are the things that need changing. So that has to do with that disruptive capacity that we need to develop. We talk a lot about adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity in the context of climate change, which says the climate is changing, that's inevitable, and we better get ready, which is true. But at the same time, it distracts from what is really needed, and that is climate mitigation, looking at the root causes. Why is the climate changing, and what can we do about that? A little bit like the manufacturing of doubt, you could say the single focus on adaptive capacity may distract from what might be more important or as important, which is disruptive capacity. So transgressive learning is an integral part of learning for sustainability. This picture just kind of symbolizes what I've been talking about. You know, we have developed and done a lot of work that has led us to the kind of world we are in today. Most of the technology that we have in this room is a result of engineering, of disciplinary science, has been extremely successful. It has brought us lots of good, but at the same time, it has had lots of spin-off problems that are now causing the sustainability challenge we face today. And that requires a new way of thinking, a new way of doing that is more holistic, more interconnected, more systemic. We need to think more in relations rather than in categories, boxes that are so disconnected, short-term thinking without thinking about long-term implications, not just here but elsewhere in the world, not just for us people but also for other species. The other thing that I think we tend to ignore is this spiral of powerlessness that we find ourselves often in, and how can we break through that spiral. There's a lot of people who have this belief that we are selfish people, that we're only after our own individual interests, that we cannot trust others, that the world of business is so powerful, we cannot break through that. That can lead to depression or even violence. And we all recognize this kind of a spiral, I think. How can we break through this? How can we create a spiral of empowerment where we believe in possibility, that there are plenty, not just plenty of goods that we can share, but there's also plenty of goodness, that we're not ultimately selfish, but ultimately we have a sense of community, a sense of belonging, a sense of place. And we need to be careful that our current lifestyles and the way we've organized our society doesn't lead to a disconnect from place, a disconnect from people, that our technologies that we all use, that connect us in a way, don't disconnect us from the physical places that we are in. A lot of people, and we could do a whole other talk about, living and learning in the digital age, and the technology of the cell phones and the laptops has brought us also many good things, but we also need to think about what it does to our real connections. I already mentioned the disruptive capacity building. For those of you who are active in higher education, it may be interesting to refer to something that is quite interesting in the Netherlands right now. At the University of Amsterdam, students have occupied basically the main offices of the university, administrative offices, and got sympathy from faculty members. And they did so because they felt there was less and less democracy at the university, and that a lot of subjects and courses that were not focusing on, say, added value for the economy were being taken out slowly out of the university, that the university became more an extension of the economy and economic thinking and a culture of accountability, where there was lack of trust in people, lack of trust in young people, and as a result, they feel they're not really part of a university anymore, as was meant, a place for human development, not for economic development, where the numbers became more and more important and drove virtually everything, where students became input, throughput, and output, and clients, and things like that. And this protest is getting some traction in the country. They were thrown out by police the other day, and as a result they got even more recognition. And now politicians are beginning to question this whole culture of accountability, and they're talking about giving more autonomy back to the university. We'll see if this really happens. But that has to do with disruptive capacity, taking a bold stance, going against the grain. Now let me close with some sustainabilities. What kinds of abilities are we talking about? You could say that there needs to be some kind of literacy about what sustainability might mean, could mean, some of the problems with the concept, but also we do know a lot. There is a lot of knowledge about climate change, for instance. The IPCC report has a lot of scientific information. We know a lot about ecosystems, accumulation of things. So there should be some literacy, but also thinking about systems more, connections, adopting a more integral view in what we do. You could call that some kind of understanding around the dynamics of sustainable development. Then this disruptive side, the critical side, questioning dominant power structures, dominant routines that we have started to find so normal, questioning the normality of those things. Looking at ethics, the ethics of what we do. The fact that our cell phones have minerals and metals that are mined in parts of Africa and Asia where people live under poor conditions, and the mine workers are not in the healthiest circumstances and are maybe being exploited. But also the e-waste. If we throw away about 1 million cell phones a day worldwide, which I think is the number, roughly, what happens to that? Where does the e-waste go? What does it do with biodiversity, the mining in the local, and the water use around those mines? How does it affect communities there? There are ethical consequences of our everyday actions and what we do. And over some of that we have control, and over some of it we have little control. But we need to think more about the ethical implications of that. So that's the critical dimension, you could say. And then there are lots of more generic kind of skills that have to do with leadership, that have to do with entrepreneurship, unlocking creativity, bringing in diversity, appreciating chaos and complexity rather than trying to tame it as reductionist, positivist science try to do. We need to learn to live with it and in a way take advantage of it. That's a different kind of outlook towards uncertainty or chaos and complexity. And we need to focus on that empowerment, that spiral of hopelessness and powerlessness. We need to turn into a spiral of empowerment. So you could call it the change and innovation dimension. Now all of this, I can imagine that somebody working for Shell or Coca-Cola company or Walmart, they too would value employees that are entrepreneurial, that consider ethics. Yes, I think they do. A lot of these qualities are qualities that could just as well help serve a company that wants to grow economically. So we need another thing, and that has to do with the kind of the existential dimension. To what end? What for? What is the direction we want to take this? What are we strengthening in our world, and what are we maybe weakening in our world? if it doesn't have that underpinning, that existential question, for what end? If it's only to accelerate growth and the economy, and maybe in a more clever or a greener way, then it ultimately doesn't contribute to sustainability, but rather to unsustainability. Now, changing that big system, and I see Mike in the back, Mike Docent, he talks about the big tanker, how to change the direction of a big tanker, which is not an easy thing. And I'm curious to see how he will address that in his workshop. So that would be the existential dimension. So if we want to facilitate sustainability in a more holistic, integrative way, and we look at our schools or universities, you could say, well, we do have the curriculum side. We do have to look at new concepts like biomimicry, cradle to cradle, closed cycle design. Where do we have that in our current schools and universities? Is there a place for that? We also need to look at the research that is taking place. And when we talk about research, I'm not talking about academic research necessarily. I'm also talking about practitioners, teachers, students engaging in research in real issues that have to do with sustainability. Whereas teachers become more reflexive and research their own practices. And in some countries, like in Finland, it's already standard part of the way they design education. There is space for doing research in your own classroom. And that provides opportunities for experimenting, and that idea of emergence, trying things out, starting as a niche in your own school. But if you don't have the space for that, it becomes very difficult. Making more connections with society, with NGOs, businesses, the local government. Oftentimes, they're disconnected from what goes on in schools and universities. How can they become part of the teaching, learning, and research? Walking the talk, school as institutions where people eat, where people use energy. How can we make the system in which we work more sustainable itself, so that the story, the narrative, becomes more believable? And finally, new forms of pedagogy, disruptive pedagogies, experiential learning, social learning. There are lots of new ways, systems thinking, oriented learning, values, clarification. These are things that we should pay much more attention to in our education processes. And in the end, it might look something like this. This is a whole school approach where you kind of see how this can be done, how the environment can be connected to the school, how there's a bit of biodiversity around the school, how there is local vegetables grown by students, maybe with a local farmer connected to the school, where bikes are being repaired by students, maybe with the help of a local bike store, who benefits because the parents will buy the new bike for their kids at that store that works with the school. Where there is a school council, where there's democracy in the school, where young people learn to make change and they feel heard and valued from the beginning, so that they become more empowered, starting at a young age already. Where there's experimenting with new forms of teaching and learning. Then you create a whole system redesign, as Stephen Sterling was talking about. This is just to connect with the UNESCO decade and the post-decade and the Global Action Program that is being developed. These are 4 areas that are being focused on, and these are in a way also 4 results that are put forward in the final report of the decade, where ESD is seen as an enabler, a catalyst for sustainable development, where it's galvanizing, leading to pedagogical innovation, where stakeholder engagement is seen as fundamental, the big 5, where it is no longer confined to schools, primary schools, secondary schools, early childhood, but also vocational schools, teacher education, community-based learning. So it has expanded to include more parts of society. And this is a kind of an optimistic view maybe, but you could say that there's a lot happening worldwide in these 4 areas. And let me end that in higher education, there are all kinds of networks around the world where education and higher education in particular is becoming more community engaged, less driven by science for impact, more driven for impact factors, I should say, but more driven by science for impact in society. These kinds of networks, I think, are interesting. They're sprouting. Maybe they're niches still, but as they connect worldwide, they do tend to become much like transition towns and other movements in society. They become regimes, and hopefully, eventually, the whole landscape will shift. Thank you. Thank you.
You have questions or comments? Rea, here in front, please.
I'm a fellow keynote speaker from yesterday and from Tallinn University, and I would like to ask you something personal. You mentioned before that we can easily turn sustainability like a greenwashing issue or something that is trendy now and be very superficial about it. And it makes a huge difference if we take sustainability with our heart and soul, so to say. Can you pinpoint any experience in your life when you recognized that your heart and soul is in that topic?
You know, when I look at my own personal life, I think very fundamental for me was the fact that I was born and raised in a family that was very much connected to nature and environment. I think my parents were always very good at taking us outside, and professionally they were both environmental educators, so that has also influenced and shaped me a lot. So there's one. The other one, I think, is that I learned early on as a student that it is quite possible to make a difference in your own world by taking initiative and trying new things and experimenting and taking a bold move. This idea of organizing. One thing that I was able to do with other people was to start a network of young people, schools, active in environmental issues, caretakers of the environment. At that time I was 20 years old. And this is a kind of a grassroots network that still exists today, bringing together teachers and students from high schools. That gave me a sense of possibility, of change, and mobilizing youth. That's very positive. Personally, I feel that has kind of defined who I am today. And it's also maybe the little things in your own everyday lifestyle. Of course, we live in a country where mobility is by bikes is easy. Everything is compact and close. In our municipality, Wageningen, there are niches that are interesting, which you want to support, whether that is the local food movement, but there's also the student activism that you connect with. You try to, in your own teaching, you try to affect young people, and hopefully they make choices that are somewhat inspired by the work you do at the university. In our everyday lives, I think little things like we have solar panels on our roof, and I think you have in the windowsill a little also solar-powered feedback mechanism that shows you how much energy at that moment you are generating in the house. I think it has influenced the children, because they would come home and they would look at it. How much are we bringing in? And that changes their thinking about switching off the lights and things like that. Little things, but they do influence, I think. If you create a kind of an ethic or an ethos and a kind of an environment that breathes sustainability, it can become contagious. And I think we can do much more in the way we design, for instance, our buildings. Our buildings don't radiate sustainability, they radiate unsustainability. And there are lots of contradictions in our current system that we should look at more closely. You know, we will have, on the one hand, we will, at the building that I'm working in, we will talk about saving energy, but at the same time we also promote flights for students to, say, Barcelona really cheap. And these are, you know, so if you look at the messages on the billboards and the walls, and it is an interesting thing to do maybe here as well. If you walk through and you try to write down all the things that work towards sustainability in this building, all the messages and all the things that work against it, you will find that there are lots of things that are working against sustainability, but we don't even see it and notice it. But they're often very subtle things that stimulate us to buy things or to get new things, and advertisement, of course. There's probably a lot more, but that would be my quick, or not so quick, response.
Hello, Arjen. My name is Paula Lindroos. I represent Baltic University Program. And I have one comment and two questions. And the comment is about this picture you left here on the screen, that in the middle left there is an empty space, and I proposed you would fill it with the Baltic University Program logo. I think that would fit very nicely.
Okay, we could maybe circulate a list and people can add, because I'm sure that, and that's actually good. This is a slide that I made maybe 2 years ago, and I've added Pearl because I gave a talk for Pearl just a few weeks ago. But I could add a lot more, and that's good news, I think.
I think you will have 5 slides after some time.
Fortunately.
Yes. Then to my question, I also encounter in talking to decision makers or rectors that at least that sometimes they take up the word Bildung, that the role of the university is to educate and to the people, to let the personal growth be in there. And I'm asking you, do you also have a feeling of that? Have you met such a question? And my second question is about the role of the teacher when it comes to sustainability, thinking about this multidisciplinarity and the methods to be used. Do we really have the capacity? I think this is a hard role for a university teacher as well as a school teacher to bring about forward these messages, really. Or should we have teams of teachers teaching one course, for instance? Thank you.
Yes. Well, the Bildung, personal growth, I like Bildung better than personal growth, because that growth thinking is also in the whole personal growth. It's almost becoming an industry itself. You know, I see a lot of young people today who get the message that they always need to grow personally, because if they don't, they will fall behind, they won't get jobs and things like that. It's driven, again, by economic interest. And it should be driven by curiosity, wanting to engage with the world, which is a different driver than that you need to grow personally all the time to keep up with the global economy. And this is kind of, it's almost a competition, you know, and also very individualized personal growth. Bildung doesn't have two things, personal and growth. And I think Bildung is more, it extends the personal, and it's not about, you know, it's not about competing with others. It's more from within. So I do hear vice chancellors talk about personal growth, but I don't hear him talk about Bildung. And I think that's maybe the next phase. As far as the capacity of teachers is concerned, I think, you know, traditionally maybe teachers were more engaged in the transmissive type of learning, where they had kind of the authority of truth, and they knew a lot about their subject areas, and they need to find good ways to teach their subject. They were actually teaching something, and the word teacher suggests teaching something. And sustainability is something that cannot be taught, in a sense, because we don't really know what it is. We do know that we need to be looking for it, but we don't know exactly what it is. If we would know it, we could teach it. And that's what makes it a wicked issue. So you cannot teach wicked issues. You can create environments in which people can learn. So we need to focus more on how do we design environments where young people can engage in everyday issues that have to do with sustainability, which are lots of things. So more emphasis on the design of the learning environment and the qualities of what makes for a good way of bringing people together, using diversity, navigating force fields, working with uncertainty, managing that, helping young people give agency, give them space so that they can do things on their own, can experiment, have trust in them. These are different qualities. They become a broker, in a way, of these learning spaces. And they have to watch, they're the guards of these learning spaces. That's a very different role of a teacher. It's a facilitator of learning, and maybe a coach when needed. And indeed, and we do have some people from teacher education here, and it will be interesting to hear their view on that, what it implies for the way we educate teachers. So I think it's possible, and working in teams, I think, makes a lot of sense. If we want to bring in diversity, we must bring in others to work with us, including our peers. We often see, we don't want to close the door, and then there may be a place for some of that learning still. I don't think we should. There's still knowledge that needs to be developed in schools. But knowledge, as E.O. Wilson says, and information is everywhere. The wisdom comes from somewhere else. So in that sense, it frees up capacity of teachers that we have the internet and Wikipedia. It should create space for doing other things that are more important than extending knowledge.